introduce our two esteemed speakers today. Please forgive me if I put the accent on the wrong syllable, as I do not speak Hungarian. And I will read their, so let me just introduce myself first. I'm Elise Giuliano. For those of you who don't know, I'm a political science professor and director of the master's program at Harriman Institute and director of a speaker series entitled U.S. Program on U.S.-Russian Relations. And it's titled that way because it's funded by Carnegie Foundation, which for the past pre-invasion and for many years has been interested in spreading knowledge of Russia far and wide and U.S.-Russian relations, and in an effort to help, I suppose, liberalize or eventually democratize Russia. So that's the kind of origin of the speaker series. And I'm very happy to host today social scientists from Hungary who have written, really seminal and what I think will become seminal books on critical issues of our day. And I'm not going to say all of my opinions, but I would just say the number of insights come fast and furious as you're reading even, the first few pages. So I really recommend to everyone to read, take a look at these books. So first we have A Concise Field Guide to Post-Communist Regimes, Actors, Institutions, and Dynamics, published by Central European Press. And this one is available on your website or the other?
It's not that long anymore. The anatomy of post-communist regimes. This is an abbreviation of that.
Okay. And
these are the books. It's three of these. Yes.
Yeah, so these are Russia's Imperial Endeavor and its Geopolitical Consequences, the Russia-Ukraine War, Volume 2. And the one that our presenters will focus on today, Ukraine's Patronal Democracy and the Russian invasion.
When was it published?
So, yeah.
This was published 2 years ago. The big one, which is the original one, is the Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes. That is a 800 pages book, and this is just a shortened version. And these two is just 5 months ago.
Thank you.
These tools are available open access
on
our website. I saw both those, and the larger one is also open access on our website.
Okay.
So that's amazing that they're open access. So something we should really emphasize. And let me just, before I introduce the speakers, say one more thing about our format today. So we are being streamed live. So this is a hybrid talk, and the recording of this talk will be posted on Harriman's website if you want to view it later. And for today, after the presentation, we will have a question and answer period. And if you're watching us virtually, please post your questions in the Q&A chat, and we will address them. Okay, now, finally, I'm happy to turn to introduce our speakers. Bálint Magyar is a sociologist. He's senior research fellow at CEU Democracy Institute. He has worn many hats through his career. He was an activist of the anti-communist dissident movement before regime change. He was an MP, member of Hungary's parliament from 1990 to 2010, and Minister of Education from 1996 to 98 and 2002 to 2006. He was an Open Society Fellow in 2015 to 2016, a Hans Speyer Visiting Professor at the New School for Social Research here in New York in 2017, and a Senior Research Fellow at CEU Institute for Advanced Study in 2018-2019. He's been publishing and editing writings on post-communist regimes since 2013, and these are his most recent books. His co-author is Bálint Madlovics, a political scientist and economist. He's a junior research fellow at the CEU Democracy Institute and visiting professor at Eötvös-Loránd University. He holds an MA in political science from Central European University and BAs in sociology and applied economics. He was a research fellow at the Financial Research Institute in Budapest from 2018 to 2019 and visiting professor at BCE in 2022. He's published peer review articles, book chapters, and books on post-communist regimes since 2015. And these are his most recent books. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our speakers. And yeah, so I would just again mention that they have a formal presentation and we will have the Q&A after the formal presentation.
Many thanks for the invitation and for the introductions. During the regime change at the end of 80s, beginning of 90s, we had some illusions. Basic illusion was that with the collapse of communist regimes, all those countries will reach the status of liberal democracies relatively soon. But it did not happen. After 10 years about, we had to face the problem that a lot of share of those countries just stuck in a position between dictatorship and democracy, genuine democracy, and therefore practically the mainstream literature, which was characterized by the notion of transitology, was replaced by hybridology, because the question arose that, okay, what kind of countries are on the scale between democracy and dictatorship? There were a lot of trial for different type of typologies, creating typologies in this respect. Maybe the most common one we just defined the intermediary types of regimes as electoral democracy, competitive authoritarian regimes, or hegemonic authoritarian regimes. But we with my friend Madlovics, we are following another typology, which was shared by János Tolnai as well, the Hungarian economist, who defined autocracy as an ideal typical stage between democracy and dictatorship. He just defined four primary features of these autocracies between democracy and autocracy. The first is that this government cannot be through formal elections changed. The second is that the institutions which should have the function to guarantee and work as checks and balances in a democracy, they are unable to fulfill this function. The third is that in spite of the fact that legal parties, opposition parties exist in this system, but they are weak and they do not have too much chance to get into government. But at the same time, there is a distinction also concerning in relation with dictatorships that there is no mass terror, just different forms of suppression, which are softer than in a, let us say, I would say normal dictatorships. The mainstream approach in the politology has two major mistakes according to us, or shortages in relation explaining those regimes which emerged in post-communist regimes after the regime changes. And these shortages were that on one hand they were concentrating only on political institutions, practically formal political institutions, and the second is that they used the language and categories which were used for the description of liberal democracies, the same language for the description of post-communist regimes. Of course, we can understand on one hand that why they were concentrating on these formal institutions and political institutions, because the regime changes meant practically everywhere a kind of constitutional revolution. The newly established constitutions were very much like the constitutions in liberal democracies. The question maybe was that whether they are parliamentarian systems, semi-presidential or presidential systems as a result of these constitutional revolutions. But there were a kind of what we call stubborn structures of values, cultures, habits, etc., informal relations behind these formal institutions, which created that absolutely different type of operation of these regimes, which emerged in the post-communist spheres and on the ruins of the Soviet Empire. The mainstream politology practically, even unconsciously, accept these three axioms, what we call hidden axioms. The first is that the separation of spheres of social action, what Klaus often writes about it, the political one, the economic and the communal spheres of social actions, separation is completed, and the relation between them formalized and transparent. But it's not the case as we are going farther and farther from west towards the east. Of course, there is a collusion between these spheres of social action, and even in the whole communist era, there was a complete merge of these spheres of social actions under the communist rule. The second such axiom is that the de jure position of persons, institutions are necessarily coinciding with the de facto positions. But it's also not the case. When in a liberal democracy we are speaking, for example, about an entrepreneur, then it's a natural thing that we assume that this person disposes over the property which formally belongs to him or her. But it's not the case in post-communist regimes, because in a lot of cases, those who are formerly entrepreneurs, legally they have some property. Of course, not they are the real owners of that property, and somebody else disposes over these properties. And the third such axiom is that the state as an actor is necessarily pursuing common good, and the real question is that whether those public policy or what they try to implement, whether they are good or not so good, or that whether there are some corrupt cases in such a societies. But if we want to understand the operation and the work of post-communist regimes, we have to open these axioms, to dissolve these axioms, and to investigate to what extent they could be accepted. Now, therefore, we thought that it's necessary to abandon that type of approach for starting to understand these post-communist regimes, which tries to position these regimes on a single axis between dictatorship and democracy, and somehow to create another other space where, as a result of the development, the trajectories of these regimes, what they're running down, has another form. The basic category for that, with which what we had to take into consideration when we dissolve these axioms, is the category of informality, and a special form of informality, hierarchical form, the patron-client relations. What we call, after accepting Henry Hayes' definition, patronalism, question of patronage. And in such a way, maintaining that type of typology, which defines the other types of democracies, autocracies, or dictatorships, we double these categories. So beyond the liberal democracy, we introduce the term patronal democracy, which means that in a patronal democracy, in a very simplified way, there are competing patron-client networks under the formal cover of political parties, but none of these patron-client networks are enough strong to subjugate, to liquidate the other patron-client networks and to create a single pyramid patron network. In the case of autocracies, as idea types, we make a differentiation between conservative autocracy and patron autocracy. Patron autocracy would mean that one single patron-client network can build a single power pyramid, subjugating and liquidating the other networks, and politically introducing an autocracy, while on the other side, the conservative autocracy also means that the political power is monopolized by a single political force, but at the same time, the different levels of the society are not patronized, they are not transformed into patron-client relations. This is a non-patronal type of regime. And in the case of dictatorships, when communist dictatorship is characterized by two main features, the one-party system on one hand, on the other hand, the monopoly or dominance of state ownership, what we call market exploiting dictatorship market exploiting dictatorship means that the one-party system is retained, but on the other hand, private property and state property and other type of properties, they are living together together at the same time. So now in this triangle, you see the some post-communist regimes in 2022 where they are, and you can see that only a smaller share are belonging to the liberal democracies, a larger share of them to patronal democracies, and another shares belong to the patronal autocracies. Now, in the first half of this lecture, I would concentrate on the patronal autocracy as one of the polar types of these regimes, and then Bálint will speak about Ukraine as a patronal democracy as a contrast, some contrast to it. You see that within the EU, Hungary is the only country which can be considered a patronal autocracy. But beyond the EU, Russia and the Central Asian former Soviet republics, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc., they belong to this model, to the patronal autocracies. The question is what they didn't use to try to explain that who is the actor in these patronal autocracies. When we're just speaking about that, we use the term ruling elite. Of course, it's true, but ruling elite is a very neutral expression. Does not mean anything beyond that. That they are those who exercise power. But the question is that who are they? And now, in a lot of analysis, you will find the different types of classification. How do they define the ruling elite? Somebody says that it's a neo-feudal order in patronal autocracies. Of course, because they are thinking of the patron-client relations, the vassal-type relations in the society. But contrary to the feudal times, at that time, in the feudalism, these neo-feudal orders had a contractual relation with each other, and it was a legitimate relation in this society. While in the patronal autocracies, patron-client relations and vassal-type relations, they are not legitimate ones. The other definition is that it's a neo-nomenclatura, just trying to copy and copy that structure of ruling elite which characterized the communist regimes, especially Soviet regimes. But of course, the ruling elite patronal autocracies is not, because a nomenclatura originally is nothing else than a register of positions which has two major pillars: the party pyramid and the non-party pyramid in it, governmental state pyramids, state positions, etc., where there are individuals accepted, put there. Those who are members of the neo-nomenclatura, they are remunerated or rewarded by incomes and consumption goods, but not with assets. These positions could not be inherited, etc., etc. So I think what is characteristic for these patronal autocracies is not neo-nomenclatura. And of course, others use the term that it's a class, a ruling class. But it's not a class, because the class means a non-personalized relation between the rulers and those who are, let us say, in the lower strata of the society, while in the patron-client relations, they are very personalistic ones. So what we use that this, the term, we introduce the term adopted political family, which means that it's a kind of political economic clan, the ruling elite of these patronal autocracies, which is an informal network, partly informal network of an extended personal acquaintances, where you practically, with adoptions, adopt not only individuals, but families in the adopted, like in a clan, which means that the non-kinship relations are transformed into quasi-kinship relations and personalized family ties in this structure. It has no formal membership, like in a feudal order or in a neo-nomenclatura. it's much more an informal type of organization. It extends over the formal institutions. And also important that contrary to the communist regimes, it is based on not organizational loyalty, but personal loyalty. The positions within the adapted for political family does not converge with the administrative positions. And it's a merger of economic and political resources in this family. And the patterns, cultural patterns within this ruling elite are the patterns of a patriarchal family or a clan. What means, when now I refer again, the misuse of the language when they try to describe or even understand some events in this, what's happening in the post-communist regimes, when analysts are starting sentences like that, that the government decided about this, the ruling party decided about that, the parliament decided about other things. All these sentences are misleading, because in a patronal democracy, none of these formal institutions decide about anything. They are, if I would like to land a term from the Soviet regimes, these are transmission belt organizations, which just rubber stamp those decisions which are brought somewhere else. But where are these decisions are decided? This is what we call the chief patron's court. When we are speaking about chief patron's court, it means that to get the chief patron's court means that there are persons there without formal and with formal positions. So if you want to understand, for example, that what is the top decision-making, let us say, quotational body in Hungary, which is not a formal institution, then you should think of the VIP box of the football stadium in Felsút, which is the village from where Orbán, the prime minister, now is coming, you know. And in that VIP box, if you have a few pictures of that from this VIP box and people there, you will find Orbán, his father, his son-in-law, the chief attorney, some ministers sometimes, 1, 2, 3 big oligarchs, etc. And this is this informal body practically, which brings the decisions. So this is important to understand, that what kind of construction is the ruling elite in Hungary. The next dimension, what we have to examine, that how this regime is acting concerning its power is practically, in a patronal democracy, is nothing else than the private expropriation of public authorities. And in this case, we can understand that in a patronal democracy, it means that the non-patronal character of these regimes are transformed into a patronal character. But if we want to understand that, what does it mean, a patronal character? Again, we have make distinctions between 4 dimensions. One is that, what is the form of those institutions where the decisions are made? And this is, I was speaking about the chief patron's court. From a formal institution, the decision-making is taken into informal institutions. The second dimension is that the regulations, the laws and decrees, are normative one or mainly quasi-normative ones, which means that they are custom tailored to the needs of rewards and punishments for the loyal persons, enterprises, institutions, NGOs to the chief patron, or those who are rivals or who anyway try to challenge that type of power. Therefore, the regulations, which should have the function to give normative rules for the operation of the society, they are transformed into discretional kind of actions under the cover of laws and decrees. These are what are called in Hungary the different lexes, where certain name of a person or enterprise is stored, and it says that this special regulation targets that person or enterprise either in a positive or a negative way.
The third dimension is that whether the decisions are made in a collective or corporate bodies or much more personal ones. These are in a patronal society regime personal ones. And concerning the hierarchy of the society, whether this hierarchy is operated through bureaucratic and institutional chains or through clientelist and personal chains. And more and more we are going toward a patronal direction, then we are closer, especially if the political power is monopolized by a single political force, to a patronal autocracy. The third dimension is that after the private appropriation of public authority, how this ruling it behaves concerning the revenues and assets of others, public assets or even private assets. And here we have to describe the economic system, a brand new category, the relational economy. It means that analysts normally used to make a difference between two systems, the socialist system and capitalist system. Now, such countries which should be considered to belong to the socialist system, planned common economy, etc. These are one or two, not too much like North Korea, which means using the categories of Karl Polanyi, they are bureaucratically embedded economy. And we use the distinction between embedded and disembedded economy. He characterizes the capitalist system where the economy is social and politically disembedded, which means that it's again referring to the first axiom that these spheres of social actions are separated, the political, the economic, and the communal spheres separated. But if we want to understand those countries, which now I think more of the countries belongs now to the model of relational economy than to the simple market economy not now in the world, which means that when Polanyi is speaking about dominant integration schemes or coordinating mechanisms, the three basic such mechanisms for him is the market mechanism, the redistribution, and the reciprocity. He argues that all of these are existing at the same time together, but the real question is that which is the dominant form from them. In a communist regime, the redistribution is the dominant form. In a capitalist system, normally they say that the market coordination is the dominant form. That is the dominant coordinating mechanism. But we have to make a difference between two types of redistribution now, going further from that definition what Karl Polanyi uses, a bureaucratic resource redistribution for the communist regimes, where this bureaucratic resource redistribution is formalized, impersonal, normative, and general for the whole society and economy, to another place where to the relational market redistribution, where it's non-formalized, personal, discretional, but dominant in this, and such a way making a difference between relational market redistribution and market coordination in between. So slightly ironically, we would say that the invisible hand of impersonal market forces in a patronal autocracy is replaced by the very visible hand of the chief patron interfering with market forces. And at the same time, it means that the chief patron in a patronal autocracy, in the relational economy, practically can expropriate not only revenues, incomes. So this system is not simply kleptocratic, but a predatory state in that sense that takes away the assets and property of others. So when we are speaking, and in literature you can read about rent-seeking societies or regimes. Of course, rent-seeking can be absolutely legal thing. And for example, one political force just expands the sphere of state coordination in a society and appoints his party cadres to the head of state institutions. Of course, it's not a nice action, but not illegal, definitely. The second level, the kleptocratic thing, is already, of course, it's a crime, but a peaceful crime, and it's referring for diverting revenues, incomes, taxes, etc., for private resources. But the predation means that you, with the help of state coercion, you take away in an illegitimate way, illegal way, the property of others. And if you want to model this process, then we could think that it's a kind of hunting process where it has three phases: the stalking phase, the hunting phase, and the consuming phase. And in the economy, we could see that on the market, for example, an enterprise have a value, what we call here, unmolested market value, which means when it's the value of the enterprise and the activity of enterprises is not under harassment by the state. Then when in the stalking phase, the chief patrons and his clients try to somehow get to know that how vulnerable is that enterprise, how can they blackmail or attack this enterprise to reduce the value of this enterprise, and at the same time, what is the forecasted value of that enterprise, using their corrupt connections and political positions to utilize those assets if they grab it. And after the stalking phase comes the hunting phase, when they destroy that enterprise, hunting down that enterprise, and this process takes place, a lot of institutions, state institutions together, and when the enterprise is hunted down and taken over, then comes the consuming phase, when they are using their relations and connections to power, and this is what we call relational value and multi-value of that enterprise. Just a very short example, but it's because we do not have time for a lot of things. After 2010, when the Fidesz seized the monopoly of political power, then there was a Hungarian-Spanish enterprise which had a concession for the lamp posts in Budapest to hang out billboards. The owner was invited, in quotation mark, invited into the Ministry of Economy, and there asked to sell his enterprise to one of the oligarchs of Orban. He refused this. Then, within a few days or weeks, the tax office and other organizations, the attorney's office, started investigations and started to destroy this company. He still resisted. Then, as a third phase, the parliament brought a law in which they prohibited to use these lampposts for advertising under the pretext that it endangers the traffic on the roads. 2 years later, or something like that, that part of his enterprise got bankrupt, or practically the value annihilated. He got a new offer to sell his enterprise even on a lower price. He did it. And then within a month or within 2 months, the parliament brought a law which allowed again to advertise on this lampposts again. What does it mean? That in such a hunting action, in the case of patronal democracy, the government, the ministry, the parliament, the tax office, the chief attorney's office, concertedly are taking place. And such an action cannot be done without the permission of the chief patron. So it's not a simple corruption. Now comes the next case, the legality of these regimes. And this is what I was speaking about now, for this concerted action of different state organizations. When we are speaking about a corrupt state, it means that even if the corruption is endemic, it's not necessarily systemic. Endemic means that it's very much general in the society, but these are mainly petty corruption type transactions where the corruption service provider can be a clerk or somebody from the public administration, but with a very limited, very narrow competence in a certain case where he or she can be corrupt. In the next phase, capture state, when we are speaking when oligarchs or criminal organizations are capturing, for example, a local government or a ministry or a state project, etc., there, of course, the so-called amplitude of arbitrariness is wider. But in the case of criminal state, which can be when a regime can consider to be a criminal state only in that case when you have the monopoly of political power. As I mentioned before, the whole range of the institutions capable exercising state coercion, they can be mobilized at the same time in one action. This is a criminal state. And the patronal autocracy is a criminal state as well. And this is why it's important to make difference of different types of corruption. I won't tell the whole thing, but let us say the typical form of petty corruption, what we call free market corruption, where there is real, let us say, competition on the corruption market. These are such type of connections where you freely enter and freely exit from a corrupt transaction. You can repeat it, but it does not build a stable vessel chains, patron-client chains. At the end, you will find a criminal state of grand corruption when the governance is operated, the whole governance as a criminal organization. This is why I used to say that Hungary has no government, it has a criminal organization. A criminal organization, grand corruption, which is coercive, centralized and monopolistic one, and creates permanent patron-client vessel type chains in the society. And now, if we now summarize these four dimensions when we try to define patronal autocracy and the naming, it's a clan state if we refer, as I told, to the actor. It's a neo-patrimonial state if we think of the private appropriation of public authority. It's a predatory state if we think about not the corruption, but a special form of corruption, what is not corruption, and therefore it's a predatory state, and a criminal state when we say that the regime itself is operated as a criminal organization. Then we can speak about a mafia state, and we were writing about the post-communist mafia states. And now we can turn now to the regime trajectories along these general lines and to the case of Ukraine as well.
Right. So up to this point, Bálint was talking about how this mafia state works and how patronal autocracies work, meaning that if a country has already reached the situation of patronal autocracy, what it means in terms of its ruling elite, in terms of using power, in terms of exercising power in the economy, and practically turning corruption from a deviance of the system into centralized and monopolized state function. However, not every country in post-communist regimes in the post-communist region has reached this situation. Rather, what we can see is various trajectories, various developmental trajectories can be distinguished in the post-communist region, and they can be visualized using this triangle and this six regime typology of two democracies, two autocracies, and two dictatorships. Here we need to distinguish primary trajectories and secondary trajectories. Primary trajectory is the first stop. It is the first stop after communist dictatorship, after, in historic terms, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Where do these countries go? There were some countries which actually went according to the teleological presumptions of transitology in the 1990s, meaning that some actually became liberal democracies. Estonia, as well as Poland and Hungary in the 1990s, they went from communist dictatorship to liberal democracy. If I want to explain this in a little bit more detail, I would say that it went from a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal system to a multi-pyramid non-patronal system. These two levels mean that first, whether there is a single power center or multiple competing power centers, that's single pyramid and multi-pyramid. And the second is whether we have these kind of patron-client relationships that Bálint was talking about, and whether they are formal or informal. In case of a communist dictatorship, we have a single pyramid, formalized bureaucratic patronal system. Both of these levels changed when Estonia, Poland, Hungary, these countries went to liberal democracy. Therefore, it became multi-pyramid and non. That's the first kind of trajectory. However, there were some countries like Romania or Ukraine, which I will be talking about a little more. They never became liberal democracy. They never became liberal democracy. Rather, they became patronal democracy. They changed from a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal system to a multi-pyramid informal patronal system. The third type of primary trajectory could be mainly observed in Central Asia, when the countries changed from one single pyramid setting to the other, from single pyramid bureaucratic patronal to single pyramid informal patronal, or from communist dictatorship to patronal autocracy. And finally, we saw in the case of China that it did something which is not even a regime change, but rather a model change. We call it a model change because it remains within the model of dictatorship. The one-party system is retained, as Bálint explained, but it changed from communist dictatorship to market exploiting dictatorship. So these are the four ideal typical primary trajectories which could be observed in these countries. Now, if you turn to the secondary trajectories, then we can see various patterns of democratic backsliding or de-democratization, or even perhaps autocratization would be the best term here, because every movement here in the secondary trajectories meant some kind of movement from a form of democracy towards a form of autocracy. But there has been variation. For example, in the case of Poland, under Kaczynski, so from 2015, what Kaczynski did was a conservative autocratic attempt. Conservative autocratic attempt, meaning that he tried to move Poland from a liberal democracy to a conservative autocracy. He tried to change the country on one of the two levels, from multi-pyramid to single pyramid, but at the same time, he kept the non-patronal nature of the system. He did not build an oligarchy. There was no such corruption, no such cases of predation that Bálint was talking about in the case of Hungary. Therefore, what he really wanted to do is to concentrate power and therefore build an autocracy while not building these, not patronalizing the economy and society. In the case of the Czech Republic, under Babiš, we saw in a way the opposite. In a way the opposite, because in that case, the multi-pyramid nature of the system was retained, whereas he tried to change it from non-patronal to informal patronal. That is, he tried to move not from liberal democracy to conservative autocracy like Poland, but from liberal democracy to patronal democracy. This is another pattern that you can observe in secondary trajectories. Third, in the case of Hungary, we see when both levels change. For multi-pyramid, non-patronal system, under Orbán, it goes to single pyramid informal patronal. So it has this long road from liberal democracy to patronal autocracy. And finally, we could observe in the case of Russia, when a country went from a patronal democracy to a patronal autocracy, from a form of system that was in the 1990s a kind of oligarchic anarchy, as we call it in our book, that it is very close to patronal democracy in the sense that it was a multi-pyramid and informal patronal system, but then Putin came along and he created a single pyramid system out of it, while keeping the informal patronal nature of the system, therefore created from patronal democracy, patronal autocracy. Now, what about Ukraine? If we want to put Ukraine in this triangle and we want to visualize or map the trajectory of Ukraine, what we need to see is it doesn't really fit these nice one or two-way trajectories that we could observe in the case of most of the countries, but rather there is a pendulum-like movement between patronal democracy and patronal autocracy. So after the Soviet Union collapsed and the country became independent in 1991, it, as I already mentioned, did not become a liberal democracy, but it became a patronal democracy. However, there were several attempts, most notably under Kuchma and Yanukovych, to change the system from multi-pyramid informal patronal to single pyramid informal patronal. That is, trying to move the country towards patronal autocracy. But these attempts were defeated. These attempts were defeated mainly in the color revolutions. At the same time, while the country couldn't move toward patronal autocracy, it could never move either to liberal democracy. It was therefore moving in this along these what we call regime cycles of patronal democracies. Now, if we want to understand why this happens, why patronal democracy of Ukraine couldn't become patronal autocracy, but also couldn't become a liberal democracy, and we want to understand why these regime cycles are there, we need to understand in a little bit more detail the concept of patronal democracy. So, as Bálint already mentioned, a patronal democracy is different from a liberal democracy, and the key difference is that what seems to be party competition is in fact the competition of informal patron-client networks. meaning that the decisions are taken out from the formal parties, from formal decision-making bodies. They are taken in informal circles, and those informal circles, the informal networks, use the parties to channel their informal agendas to the formal realm of politics. Now, if you just look at the political competition, we will find various kinds of parties: left-wing parties, right-wing parties, conservatives, social democrats. But these, in fact, are cover ideologies. Cover ideologies in the sense that behind each of these parties, behind each of these parties, there is an informal patronal network, and each informal patronal network, each adapted political family, is led by a twin motive: the twin motive of power concentration and wealth accumulation. They want to use the parties to maximize power and to access state resources to them. Now, in such a system, if any of these networks gets into power, it will try to become a single pyramid. It will try to become the dominant force. It will try to subjugate, eliminate, or marginalize all its competitors to maximize its power and to stay in power and to practically achieve a patronal autocracy. In this sense, what every player in such a system tries to do when they get into power is to break down the system, to break down the multi-pyramid nature, to break down pluralism, to break down democracy. This is why we say that while legitimacy challenge is an anomaly in a liberal democracy, it is the norm in a patronal democracy. Democracy is always in danger in such a system. However, what we could see in the case of Ukraine is that such attempts were defeated. And they were defeated because even though the ruling network tried to become the dominant single pyramid and tried to change the system from multi to single pyramid system, it was defeated because the ruling network was never strong enough compared to the opposition networks and also a free and vibrant civil society. Those two together, the opposition networks and the free civil society, joining forces, could repel all these attempts, all these autocratic attempts. So there were autocratic attempts, but they could never become autocratic breakthroughs, let alone autocratic consolidation, which would be the third phase and which we could see in the case of Russia after Turkey. No, in this case, only autocratic attempts happened, and therefore they could be reversed in electoral or extra-electoral ways, by which, of course, I mean the two color revolutions, the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine, or as the Ukrainians like to call it, the revolution of dignity. Now, what is the problem? The problem is that even though these color revolutions, they looked very, very promising. And indeed, if you look at the comments of Western observers on all these color revolutions, what we could see was a great optimism. And that great optimism can be understood if we take into account that the mainstream political science, as Bálint explained, is thinking in the democracy-dictatorship axis. If you're thinking in a single axis, then you would interpret the color revolutions in the following way. Before they were closer to a more oppressive regime, towards dictatorship, they had a more oppressive system, but now with the color revolution, they are moving to the less oppressive system. And that less oppressive system, if you have a single axis, can only be, by definition, a liberal democracy, and hence the optimism. However, if we give up the single axis of democracy and dictatorship and we expand it into the triangle, then we have to see what is going on behind all these processes. And what is going on behind is that even though the ruling network was defeated, the opposition networks remain. And if the opposition networks remain, after the autocratic attempt is defeated, another network will get into power, and once again it will try to break down the system. So there are always democratic transformations, but there is no anti-patronal transformation. This is what creates the regime cycles. This is what has created the regime cycles for 30 years in the case of Ukraine. There were anti-democratic transformations, autocratic attempts, and democratic transformations, but never anti-patronal transformation. Always attempts to break down this multi-pyramid kind of system to a single pyramid, but it was never defeated, it was never successful, but it only returned to square one, in a way, to the business as usual model of patronal democracy. Now, even so, even before the full-scale invasion. If you look at what happened in Ukraine after the Euromaidan revolution, actually, we have to acknowledge that there was an anti-patronal attempt trying to break out of these cycles. And that was mainly the result of two forces joining forces. What is the civil society and the increasing role of civil society and local governments that we can observe in this period? So after 2013, there was a real mushrooming of various anti-corruption NGOs and watchdogs, and they got involved in local and national government in the case of Ukraine. Also, there was a decentralization reform in 2014 in Ukraine, which strengthened the national governments vis-a-vis the central government. And the anti-patronal agenda of all these actors, it was elevated to the rank of central politics with the election of Zelensky. With the election of Zelensky in 2019, an anti-patronal president was elected, the first president of post-communist Ukraine who was not backed by one of the clans, who was not backed by an informal patronal network, who was not the head of an informal patronal network. He had an oligarch behind him, Kolomoisky. I will talk about him in just a few minutes. But anyway, he had a very strong anti-patronal agenda, and therefore, together, the combination of social activism and Zelensky's exceptional legitimacy and anti-patronal agenda, they posed a challenge to the patronal element of Ukraine's patronal democracy. Before the full-scale invasion, we couldn't really know which side is winning. Now, with the full-scale invasion, we see that there are two processes. One is the weakening of the oligarchic and patronal elements and the strengthening of the anti-patronal. Meaning that on the one hand, oligarchs are losing their freedom. They are losing their wealth. They are losing practically their properties are being destroyed. Markets are destroyed in Ukraine. While on the other hand, Zelensky centralizes power. The state goes into war mode, and that immediately brings power centralization. But he uses this centralized power to crack down on the oligarchs, practically to intensify his fight against the patronal element of Ukraine's patronal democracy. And therefore, what we see now is a kind of breaking out of these regime cycles. As the war, of course, is a horrible thing, and it shakes the whole society and the whole country and the whole political economic system of Ukraine. But this also means that it shakes the oligarchic structures. It shakes the patronal structures, and that is used by Zelensky and actually together with society in the second volume of this two-volume collection. One of our authors calls it socially inclusive warfighting as opposed to the socially exclusive warfighting of Russia. So together, they are now breaking out of regime cycles and carrying out an anti-patronal transformation. However, there is still a problem. And the problem is that what is Zelensky doing right now? He centralizes power and he neutralizes the oligarchs. Now, what did Putin do back in the early 2000s? He centralized power and neutralized the oligarchs. So, is Zelensky doing something similar? Is it the same, what we are observing? So is it true what I was telling you, that now he is actually carrying out an anti-patronal transformation? Or are we just seeing that now finally there is someone who can become the dominant player and who can eliminate, subjugate, marginalize all the other players and create the single pyramid network and the patronal autocracy? Now, especially in the first volume, involving many Ukrainian authors as well, we try to dig into this and we try to analyze what is really happening in Ukraine. And our answer is no. Our answer is that what Zelensky does is not what Putin did back then, and what he's building is not a patronal autocracy. And that is because Zelensky, even though he builds a single pyramid power network, it is not an informal patronal. There are some similarities. What his power network is ruling elite is a pyramid-like power. There is personal loyalty of clients. If you look at how he appoints and who he appoints to leading positions of state, if you think about Yermak, his chief of staff, of course you will see the element of personal loyalty. you will see the increasing power of the president, decreasing power of the parliament. These four features can be found in the case of Zelensky, as well as patronal autocracies like Russia, like Hungary, Central Asian republics. However, there are four major dissimilarities. First one is that decisions are not taken out of formal institutions. Rather, they are moved to a formal body, the National Security Committee of Ukraine. This is the first one, as opposed to the patron score that Bálint mentioned. Second, there are no discretionary rewards and punishments. Rather, there are normative anti-oligarchic measures, meaning that even those oligarchs are attacked, even those oligarchs fall victim to the anti-oligarch measures of Zelensky, who supported him, namely Kolomoisky, I already mentioned it. In the case of a patronal autocracy and a single pyramid patronal network, what we would see and what we do see in Russia and Hungary, other countries, that the insiders are protected and the outsiders are. That is the kind of targeted punishment and rewarding in a patronal autocracy. In the case of Zelensky, we do not see it. We see a normative punishment of oligarchs, a normative fight against oligarchic structures. The third one, there is no personal wealth accumulation in the sense that there are no new oligarchs created. So even though there is corruption, of course, but it is not a central state policy. It's not a central state policy in the sense that would be creating what we call patron-bred oligarchs, a new class, or rather a new group of oligarchs. What we see, this is also described in the first volume. There is a chapter on it, on the status of oligarchs and how they are losing footing, written by two Ukrainian authors. They are also describing what is Russia doing in the territories that it controls in Ukraine. And what we can see there, what we can see in the Russia-controlled territories, that already there they started hunting, started depredation of local entrepreneurs and local properties, taking them away and giving them to their own local clients. Immediately, even there, they cannot, in a way, jump out of their skin. Even there, they are following this informal patronal attitude. In the case of Zelensky, we do not see this. And finally, we also do not see what we would call transit nationalization. So very often what we see in patronal autocracies is that there is a property of an outsider. It is nationalized, but it is indeed taken into temporary state care. Because after the state pumps some money into it and restructures it a bit, it is then reprivatized in a targeted manner to one of the clients of the adopted political family. There are nationalizations in the case of Zelensky, but we do not see such targeted reprivatization to any of his clients or any member of his network. Therefore, what we say is that Zelensky's power network, it is a bureaucratic power network, as opposed to an informal single-pyramid power network that is in the case of Putin or Orban. What the real threat now to Ukraine's patronal democracy, or rather democracy in general in Ukraine, is that even though there is anti-patronal transformation, the question is, will there be democratic transformation? Will Zelensky let go of the power? Will he reinstitute democracy after the war ends? This is something that Masha Gessen wrote just yesterday in her article, but also we analyzed this in detail in this volume. These two different trajectories. First, there is the trajectory, the more optimistic one, that there is anti-patron and democratic transformation, and therefore the country indeed breaks out of the regime cycles in the direction of liberal democracy. But there is also the situation which is similar to the situation of Georgia in the 2000s, when Saakashvili had a very strong anti-patronal agenda, but at the same time he built a single pyramid network, and he did not. He was very strongly anti-democratic, and actually moved the country towards conservative autocracy. This is what we will have to see. What we'll have to see in the case of Ukraine, and in these volumes, we try to give a diagnosis of what is happening in Ukraine, what is happening to these deep structures of Ukraine, and we try to analyze the various factors that might influence on which path Ukraine will be going. Will it be going towards an autocracy after the war ends, or can it break out of the regime cycles in the direction of liberal democracy? Thank you for your attention.
Wow, well, I think this is the best argument for the point that there is something to studying to area studies and studying all post-communist states in comparison with each other. It's really impressive, and I'm sure people have a lot of thoughts and a lot of questions. So I guess I want to, if I will begin with a question, or maybe it's a clarifying question. I guess going back to a previous slide in the second presentation, my question was, what is the relative power during these moments of transition of civil society and the alternative, the competing or alternative political and economic networks? For example, when you spoke about the transition in Ukraine and you compared to the transition of Hungary, I thought maybe if you could talk a little bit more about how Orbán was able to take over and how in Ukraine, the opposite outcome. So how, I don't know how to say which slide it was, but how do you kind of conceptualize the relative importance or the strength or measure the strength of civil society versus alternative political and economic networks at these moments of attempts to either autocratize or democratize?
Right. We should start from that. We should start from the observation that there are many patronal regimes in these in the post-communist region. We actually argue that Bálint already mentioned this term stubborn structures, that this kind of informal patronalism, it comes from a set of values, a set of attitudes, and all those informal networks that had been there before the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and then they're transformed, and new ones were formed, of course, and they took over all these formal institutions and operate them in their own way. This happened in many countries. It happened in Ukraine, in Romania, in Slovakia, Bulgaria, many other countries. However, if you look at post-communist countries, not so many of them actually became patronal autocracies. Not too many of them became patronal autocracies like Hungary. Like Ukraine remained patronal democracy, just as Slovakia, Romania, all of them. And there are two major institutional constraints that need to be mentioned. One is the proportionate electoral system, and the other one is divided executive power. If you have a proportionate electoral system, that means that you practically cannot obtain the monopoly of political power. It is very, very difficult. We define obtaining the monopoly of political power by that if one actor or one group has the power to change one-sidedly without the consent of the opposition, the constitution, the electoral law, and also appoint the heads of those institutions which should serve as checks and balances to the government. If one force can do that, then we are talking about an autocratic breakthrough. And that is the start of a patronal autocracy. Now, such power concentration is prevented by these two institutional factors, the proportionate electoral system and the divided executive power, which once again means that such power is very much more difficult to be concentrated in one hand. But afterwards, what is happening is also the third phase, which is after autocratic breakthrough comes autocratic consolidation. And this is where civil society comes in. So in the case of a country like Hungary, and in a country like Russia, especially, where such a regime has been there for a longer time, what these regimes are trying to do is not just to monopolize the power, but also to try to eliminate any potential for the emergence of an autonomous power center, the emergence of an opposition, an effective opposition practically. And to do that, they have to break the autonomy of civil society. They have to break four major autonomies. They have to break the autonomy of the media, the autonomy of entrepreneurs, the autonomy of NGOs, and the autonomy of the citizens in terms of civil rights and democracy. if they can transform in the society autonomous positions into patron-client dependencies, then there will be no more autonomous resources. And if there are no autonomous resources, then they cannot be turned into an effective opposition. Therefore, cutting the sociological ground from the emergence of any alternative to the regime. In the case of Ukraine, there was no such power, no single pyramid network which could do this and break these autonomies. And therefore, this civil society and also the other networks, together, they could, in a way, counterbalance all those attempts, these autocratic attempts that happen. But when an autocratic breakthrough can actually happen, where, for example, in the case of Hungary, we didn't have the institutional constraints, we had a very disproportionate system, electoral system. And when Orbán in 2010 got the two-thirds majority, supermajority in the parliament, he had that kind of power and he could start breaking all these autonomies and transforming the autonomous positions to patron-client dependencies, and therefore breaking the autonomy and chances of removing him on elections. So this is the.
Thank you. Can I just one quick follow-up? So autonomous in the case of civil society, an autonomous civil society sounds like it would be stronger if it was more institutionalized in terms of strong and independent formal organizations. But actually, I think in Ukraine, it was maybe the opposite, right? Like it was the people power and protests on the street that made civil society autonomous.
Well, by autonomous, I only mean the independence from the central government and independence from the main patron-client network. Also, about institutionalization, I would argue that institutionalization happens after the Euromaidan revolution. So to a great deal, when all these new NGOs are emerging, also when programs start in Ukraine like Prozoro, which is an online platform to which various government organizations are taking part, where all public procurement tenders have to be advertised, and the whole process of them from the call to the actual realization, everything is made transparent in an online and in a researchable way. So this is, for example, one thing of institutionalization.
If you go back to this chart, it shows that patronal democracy, just because they are competing patron-client networks, it creates independent position in the different spheres of culture, media, administration, economy, law, NGOs, etc., etc. Just because it's not centralized, there is not a single pyramid patron-client network which could subjugate and eliminate the autonomy of these representatives of different spheres, and this creates a possibility while different patron-client networks are fighting with that of which is just in power. Of course, they lean on the autonomous institutions one at the same time.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's very rich and very interesting as well in many respects, also very convincing. I have a couple of questions which are somehow also connected to each other. The first is perhaps the obvious one when it comes to social sciences. So you use the dichotomy between formal and informal, which is very central to the whole theory, it seems to me. Now, how do you measure or how do you operationalize the concept of informality, right? I mean, of course, one could start from the premise that, well, any political system, of course, mixes formality and informality in various ways. So I think that's a very crucial one here for analytical purposes. And the other one is a larger question, really, and it concerns, in a sense, going beyond the regionalist or the post-communist framework and trying to think, in a sense, in a global context, right? You mentioned what you call the secondary trajectory, right? Which I think is a very important part of the story, that in the early 21st century, basically in the first and the second decades of this century, you have a trend, right? Every country is moving in a certain direction, whether the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, or what have you. Now, this is something to do with larger global trends. Or is it something very specific to the post-communist region? And if so, why? Because you could say oligarchization is a trend in the Netherlands, in the UK, and in the US to a large extent around the same time. So by that, I wanted to basically ask whether you would think these theories are somehow applicable also outside the post-communist world, or whether you would say there are those liberal democracies which you here in a way construct as an ideal type, right? To contrast these. Do those really exist?
Let me start with this last question. We started to deal with post-communist regimes because of two reasons. One is very obvious that we are much more familiar on that ground, and with this history. The second is that it created a very good opportunity that there was a historical event until that time. All regimes were communist dictatorships. So when we were investigating trajectories, they came from the same pole of communist dictatorships, and that you could compare them. But of course, if you want to expand this model for other societies, other countries, not just for post-communist ones, then we have to give up some other axioms which were not needed to be given up in this case. One is that, for example, we assume that the formal cover, institutional cover of informal networks in post-communist regimes, they are political parties. But if we are going to other countries, third world countries, for example, then they can be military groups, military hierarchy. It can be religious organization, religious hierarchy, Iran, Egypt for military, etc., etc. Then we have to give up to solve that axiom that the formal cover, the formal owner of the power, or exerciser of power, they are political parties through other institutions. There is another thing what we did not have to dissolve, that that there is a capable state in these countries, so there are no failed states. It happened only at the beginning, middle of the 90s that there was what we call oligarchic anarchy in the case of Russia, to some extent in Ukraine as well, but not really that way. But otherwise, they were states which could operate and exercise their power. It was just a secondary question that for the sake of whom, But for example, there are failed states in the Soviet Union and this so. And now turning to your first question, there is a myth of measurability in social sciences. So if you think of the works of even Karl Polanyi or Max Weber, of course they are not that type of work like engineers or in natural sciences you could measure. The problem really this is with the language, that the data what you can collect, especially for large-scale comparative studies, what you collect, it determines the language, and then the language determines the data collection, and it's a vicious circle, and you cannot get out of these things. But of course, there are other things when they try to compare the different regimes, where there is only a quasi-measurability. For example, in the indexes, for example, the Freedom House uses, they are just personal judges of experts for certain questions on a scale from 1 to 5 or something like that. Then it's a little bit misleading, but at the end, you compare countries in certain respects that one of them got 3.35, the other 3.43, and you think that, but it's very difficult to say that whether they are valid differences. Of course, when there are big differences, it's okay. Then you go. And when we create this model, then now you should show this. We have a 3D model for that, where for this, in the case of triangles, it needs some preparation for that. When it's 3D triangles are defined by at least 10 different dimensions. What you have to judge, and mainly as a dominant thing, Kell ezeket hozzá, vagy nem?
No. Okay, so let me just show you real quick. So this triangle, which we showed you in just in a two-dimensional way, and we showed various trajectories in it, just very quickly how those trajectories came into being, because this also comes through question of measurability. To that, we have this interactive 3D model. So here is the triangle with two democracies, two autocracies, and two dictatorships. And the way certain countries are put into it, for example, let me just put there Russia back in the Soviet times, that we distinguished, or we cut up this triangle by various dimensions. For example, first, here you can see the mainstream political science terminology: electoral democracy, competitive authoritarianism, hegemonic authoritarianism, and so on. We don't say that these are meaningless categories. What we do say is that they are too general. If you say that a country is competitive authoritarian, it can be a highly patronal one or a not so patronal one, even a conservative one. So therefore, what you have to do is to add another dimension, for example, patronalism. And if you put those two triangles on top of each other, then competitive authoritarianism would be somewhere here. And it would mean that if you put a country there, that a competitive authoritarian regime can either be no patronal or informal patronal. And this way, we define 10 different dimensions. 10 different dimensions. Just, I'm not going to show all of them, just, for example, formality of institutions, formal, semi-formal, informal, corruption. What is the nature or the function of corruption in the system? Is it system destroying, system constituting, or as we call it, system lubricating in the case of communist dictatorships? So what is the nature of ideology? Is the regime ideology driven, ideology neutral, ideology applying? What is the function of the ruling party? Is it really ruling? Is it really governing? Our decisions are taken within the confines of the party, or they are taken out and the party is made into a transmission method by third dimension, and so on and so forth. And if we put a certain country there, then they have to be at the same point in all the triangles. And this is how we define a certain country along so many dimensions in this, what we call a conceptual space. A conceptual space mainly defined by the three polar type regimes: liberal democracy, communist dictatorship, and patronal autocracy. And in that conceptual space, you can pinpoint a certain country in a certain point in time. Of course, when a regime changes, then the point moves. And this is how trajectories are created. And for example, you already saw Ukraine's trajectory, which is like this, it's moving like that. There is Russia's trajectory. Let me just take out the dates now. So it follows a different trajectory going down really to patronal autocracy, and now during the war actually going towards dictatorship. But also you can see, for example, the cases of Poland and Hungary, just very, very briefly. So if I put here, then the pink is Poland, and the other is the brownish is Hungary. Now, you can see that what I already mentioned, that's what Poland was going towards. In the case of Kaczynski, it was a conservative autocratic attempt, whereas in the case of Orban, we saw a change toward patronal autocracy. However, if I do this, now I return to mainstream political science. Because here what you have is the democracy dictatorship axis. And this is what you will actually find in comparative analysis of Orban's Hungary and Kaczynski's Poland. That yes, Orban is further away, it is more autocratic than Kaczynski's Poland was, but they're practically on the same road, they are going toward in the same direction, away from liberal democracy towards a more oppressive regime and the two black sheep of the EU. This is the general narrative that you will find. However, if I go back to the triangle, you will see the enormous difference between them. And this can only be seen if we really give up this single axis and we start adding all these dimensions and try defining these trajectories and pinpointing the certain countries in relation to these six regimes.
So practically, for measuring the differences between the different regimes, we had maybe the same method like the Freedom House for each country's we were consulting with 3-4 experts when we tried to point these regimes in a certain time within the different dimensions of these triangles, and then to see that what was the most characteristics for them. But of course, we provide just a language, a language, and we do not say that it is definitely exactly this way, because this 3D model makes it possible that in the case for education, yes, you can show it as that you can even contradict to us, and you want to say that no, you think that this regime is going that way or another way, and you can save photocopy of this what you made in this model.
Yeah, so you actually have this function built in, and this whole thing is, by the way, available on our website for free. You can access it. It's postcommunistregime.com, and there you will find this 3D model.
And of course, it's on our website, the postcommunistregimes.com. It's available for anybody. But this is what you showed already, yes, that in a certain point, in a certain time, the regimes have to be at the same point of the triangle. This is these consultations that really where you put these regimes in a given time.
This is what creates coherence.
It's not sure that to such an extent you can expand this model beyond the post-communist regimes. Because what I was speaking before, that if you dissolve that the state is stable, or you dissolve that these are political parties, then you are not speaking about political parties. These are other dimensions in it. So it maybe becomes then too complicated.
But that is a future project that we are actually pursuing, trying to expand this framework. So actually, this whole project goes through an evolution. It started from a theory for Hungary. Now it became a theory for post-communist regimes and the more full-fledged sixth regime typology. And we are hoping to expand it to other regions.
Well, I'm impressed. And I'm wondering,
we hoped.
I wonder about if other people are impressed. How has this been received so far?
Very well, especially as you go from west towards the east, they are more and more impressed, because they knew that language, what is provided for them by the mainstream politology, they cannot tell their own stories on that language. And then when I wrote in 2015, first in Hungarian, my book about the Hungarian mafia state, and then it was published in English, and after in Russian, and it was published in Russia. Then at the biggest private publishing house, and the leader of it, Irena Prohorova, told me that this is the book what they waited for, because it was written about Hungary, but it's absolutely the language is about Russia, so they can tell their own story in Russian. And it was not an accident that the cover of the book was unread, and the one of the heads of the Russian eagle were put there as a monster, and these huge letters written in Russian that Anatomia Postkomunistickого Mafiosa Gosударства, and these small letters that on the example of Hungary, Napример Hungary, so they understood this, and when the model was expanded, and even the Peace book, the Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes, was published in Russian during the war, which was a very brave deed, and it's public, it's open access, in Russian language as well. We had the problem that in some countries they told, like within the EU, in Bulgaria, it was published in Bulgarian, the small Hungarian book, or in Belarus, that they have the same mafia state, and I had to tell them, no, you do not have mafia state. You have criminal organizations, oligarchs, etc. But what is not that, and
you have to work for that if you want to become a criminalist.
Yes, and I would say that of course our primary audience, they are the young generation, master and PhD students, and those in social sciences who are not specialized in this field. Because if you use a language for 20, 30 years, you do not give up.
for an intellectual, for an intellectual, the biggest asset, the most valuable asset of his works and the language what he used. So of course, nobody wants to lose this. So as an alternative, not mainstream approach, of course, it has difficulties to break through, but otherwise it expands.
But we do have some, I should say, just in a follow-up. We got some very nice reviews for this framework in mainstream Q1 Western journals like what's it called, Europe Asia Studies, or Socioeconomic Review had a review symposium on the book, and 4 reviews, and all 4 were very, very positive. And many other, they actually can be found on our website in various languages. And also that the very fact we are invited here, we believe this is also, and also before we were at the University of Pennsylvania just yesterday, before we were at the GW in Washington, and had a book launch there and a workshop as well around this framework practically. Also before, a few months ago, we were at UCL in London, where we were invited because for a roundtable talk around our framework and how it can be applied, and how it can be perhaps even refined, and what we think about Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So we do have some successes, and most of these response that we get is actually rather positive.
The first small book about the Hungarian mafia state was published in 5 languages. The next one, The Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes, also 5 languages. The small, concise field guides of post-communist, also 5 languages. And now this one, which was published in English, it's coming out in Ukrainian and in Russian also. And we pay a great attention to have open access as much as it is possible. And our website, at least 2/3 of these books are of different languages are available open access as well. And we created PowerPoint presentations, not just short ones, but which could be used for in higher education as courses of master or PhD students as a course. So 11 presentations, even in English, Russian, and Hungarian are available for the big book. So anybody wants to teach, have a course of this, then it could be done. Because what we're speaking about now in such a short time is just a abbreviation of the whole idea.
And in terms of reception, it has the advantage of using regular language and conceptual development that can speak to non-specialists, which I think you said. But when I think about American political science, which in a way seems to be going in the other direction, and I don't want to make any direct criticism, but I'm just saying the receiver, the audience for that kind of work is maybe not as wide as the audience for this kind of conceptual and broadly comparative work, as we see with Masha Gessen just publishing a long article in New Yorker and mentioning the book and mentioning some of the concepts or the categorization of these countries. And apropos, we have a comment from one of the online visitors, Cheryl Stroshine, who's a political scientist in the UK. She said, really interesting, thank you, and hello.
Thank you. She was there just.
We just now had a presentation at the UCL in London. Yeah.
I have one more question. Okay. So thinking about the collapse of free media in Russia and maybe comparing it to what's going on now with the media, comparing maybe is too strong a word, discussing it in the context of what's going on now with the media in Ukraine. Sometimes the collapse of free media in Russia is described as one of the several fatal problems was that the free media in the 90s, as kind of different, as vibrant as it was in many ways, didn't have the money to support themselves, and so relied or gave some of the shares in their companies to the state or to oligarch owned companies aligned with the state, and so therefore put themselves at risk when the time came for Putin to consolidate and go after the oligarchic owners of television stations, for example. And just thinking a little bit about, and anyone who knows more about this, like, feel free to correct me, but thinking about media in Ukraine, it's often been criticized, prior to Zelensky period, been criticized as, well, oligarchic owned media, it's not really the ideal kind of free media. And this was just generally seen as a negative in common understanding, but it sounds almost like in your model, or whatever we want to call it, the kind of oligarchic owned media is more autonomous and maybe more robust to attempts by state actors to kind of take over or reduce that autonomy, to try to move in a autocratic patronal, try to produce patronal autocracy. Is that an assessment about Ukraine that you would?
Well, on the one hand, we would say that the oligarchs themselves were autonomous and they use their media.
Yeah.
And of course, that doesn't mean that the media themselves were autonomous
from
the oligarchs,
okay.
But they were autonomous from the central and the ruling patron-client network. And if they were, and this is what enabled them during the color revolutions for the oligarchs, for example, to give this media space to the protesters and to the civil society actors, and trying to amplify their voice and to make them much more effective during this color revolution. So, for example, so this is this kind of autonomy was exercised. So the oligarchs had the autonomy. We introduced this category of autonomous oligarch in the work, as opposed to various forms of subordinated ones. And they, of course, would use the media on the one. On the other hand, this triangle that Bálint showed, when there is not a single pyramid, but multiple pyramids, between the pyramids, there can be autonomous media, which are actually independent from the rule of either oligarchs or even the central, the ruling patron-client network. It is much more different, for example, in the case of Hungary. If you look at the media space there, much of the private media was concentrated in a conglomerate called Kashmir. Now, that Kashmir came into being in a very curious way. It came into being by 400 or something, 450 or around that, 450 media outlets with various owners. And on the same day, they decided to voluntarily give up all their medias to this Kashmir outlet. And this is immediate. If you're just looking at the formal level, you would think that this doesn't make any sense. But if you take into account that they are actually part of the informal patron network, and such acts are what can be seen as moments of truth. These are moments of truth because they show that in fact they had no autonomy. They were really not autonomous players, and the media they had on their name, de jure, was not their actual property de facto. They actually had to give it up when they were told. And so this is one of the axioms that I mentioned, the lack of coincidence of de jure and de facto positions. And you could very much observe that in this conglomerate coming together when 400 owners just wake up and give away really billions of forints worth, or tens or even perhaps $100 million worth of media just for free as a gift. They give it away. It doesn't make sense if you keep that axiom that you have to focus on the formal institutions, but it makes a lot of sense when you take into account all these informal patron-client networks. Now that is a kind of pattern and kind of case that you can observe in a patron autocracy, but not in a patron democracy, where there is still autonomy and there are still autonomies.
Well, something to add is that there are simplified way three types of owners of, let us say, nationwide media. Now, the state one is for the public media, local owners of a country, and foreign owners. Now, the paradox situation in these post-communist regimes that in the Philippines it is a state-owned media. Those who are in power, they always try to operate it as an instrument of the ruling party in that case. So it's always in danger that it's not practically over, it's a BBC type media. The other case, when the owners are local so-called entrepreneurs in Eastern Europe or in its post-communist regions, those entrepreneurs or investors not investing only in media, but they are oligarchs. They have their primary interest beyond the media. The media is just the tool for having informal power, blackmailing, creating compromise, etc., etc. So it endangers also the democracy and the freedom of the media. And this is why, for example, and this anti-oligarchic law in Ukraine was very important, that you could not combine these resources of power, being a huge entrepreneur, a monopolist of a branch of industry, having media and buying up a political party, because all these are together. The third owner, who are foreigners, I think they are the real guarantees for democratic free media in these countries. This happened in Poland because when, for example, with some not acceptable compromises, the German owner sold their media share to the Polish oil company, which belonged to the state. It endangered to ruin practically the freedom, while the American-owned other TV, nationwide TV, resisted of these autocratic attempts, and they saved it. And this is the case in Hungary, that we have beyond the public media, two big nationwide TV channels. One of them is belonging to the Orban's clan, and the other is German-American ownership, and they are still resist. Of course, they are not too critical to the government. They do not have too much political programs, but at least every day in the news there is 5-10 minutes in which critical views you can read it. So this is the paradox situation, that the guarantee of the media ownership at the national level, nationwide TV level, these are the foreign owners, Western owners.
Yeah, that's sort of an anomaly, I suppose. Interesting. Okay, well, this has been really fascinating. And oh, okay, just one comment from someone online, Susan Fritz. I believe that as part of the de-oligarchization law, Zelensky forced the oligarchs to divest of their media. What impact will that have on its transition?
Thank you. Well, cover. So. Are there any other?
No, that's the only question.
It's a remark, yes.
Well, that's more of a remark. I think we
covered.
partly covered it just now. With the anti-oligarch plan.
I guess we could, thinking about this conversation makes me think of the opening scenes of Servant of the People, Zelensky's television show. And I don't know if you've seen that, but he has the kind of whole oligarch networks controlling political parties portrayed quite starkly in the first 2 episodes.
Any other persons or viewers has questions, on our website, we have our email addresses,
Okay.
we are available.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
if you didn't hear that, the email addresses are on their website. So thank you. Thank you for that. That's very generous of you. And you've been very generous with your time. So thanks to everyone for coming and for these books.